This is CivClassics, a server where players can build nations, religions, cultures, and so much more. Today, the server is pretty peaceful, with the exception of the occasional lone raider, but even then, they're nothing more than a small nuisance. But the Civ community is more than a decade old, dating the whole way back to 2010, so as you can imagine, it hasn't always been this way. In fact, it was only recently that the server's nation started to prosper again, as only a year ago, the NATO-Mir War ravaged the server. The NATO-Mir War lasted nearly 2 years, affecting almost 1,000 players. Due to the war lasting so long, it is now referred to as the Infinity War. This is the story of the longest, most brutal war in Minecraft history. In 2019, tensions were rising in Mount Augusta. Mount Augusta was a respected, trade-centric city-state in the Minus Plus quadrant. January 4th of 2019, a citizen of the Holy Jaded Empire, Base 20, would travel to Mount Augusta alongside 2 others, where they would break its laws and start a fight with some citizens of Mir. This minor scuffle would escalate. This would lead to the Mirian Greggy 165 attempting to break into a vault of the Holy Jaded Empire. Following this failed attempt, the Holy Jaded Empire would then successfully launch a counterattack in which they would destroy Mir's bunker on January 29th of 2019. But this counterattack was not just the Holy Jaded Empire. No, it was troops from many nations in the Northern Axis Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. The NATO alliance was composed of Halo, Polska, Tel Aviv, Anwin, Valria, Colombia, Rhodesia, and of course, the Holy Jaded Empire. Powerful nations providing a substantial fighting force backed by copious amounts of wealth. Now, with the actions of NATO being drastic, Mir would retaliate to having their bunker disabled. Mir staged an ambush on the Great Overland Rail, specifically on a track between the Commonwealth, a nation who sympathized with Mir, and Mount Augusta, where it all began. Easy2Clutch, a Mirian fighter, would bait a large group of NATO fighters to a trap set on this railway. Hangovered, one of the NATO fighters would fall in. Once in the trap, Easy2Clutch would continue to fight, while other members of Mir would log in to help finish the job. This ambush would be successful, claiming the first fatality of the war. Hangovered, a NATO fighter, was pearled. On CivClassics, when someone kills another player with an ender pearl on their hotbar, that player is then bound to the pearl and stuck in the end until the pearl is destroyed. With this successful ambush complete, Mir took to the server subreddit with an official declaration of war against the NATO alliance. With this post, January 30th of 2019 is marked as the official start date of what would become the longest and most sophisticated war Minecraft has ever seen. The war was underway, and with it came the very first notable event, the Siege of Pinkerton. Not long after the declaration of war, Mir launched a large-scale attack against the Pinkerton Vault near Mount Augusta. This vault, owned by the Holy Jaded Empire, was a large excavated hole with a bunker in the center. Just to explain why a siege like this takes so much manpower and time, it's important to understand CivClassics uses a protection plugin, Citadel. It allows players to reinforce individual blocks costing stone, iron, or diamond, making said block harder to break. A single diamond reinforced obsidian block would take an individual with an efficiency 5 diamond pickaxe an hour and a half to destroy it by themselves. So for sieges like this, you don't only need a large amount of players to break these vaults, but you also need a lot of time. Especially considering the owners will often be present to fight back. And that's exactly what happened at Pinkerton. Mir forces weren't able to just walk in with a large group and destroy the vault in a few hours. They first had to hold off NATO's fighters while doing so. However, NATO provided minimal resistance and would lose the Pinkerton Vault as Mir would capture it on February 2nd, 2019. The Pinkerton Vault at this point was not easily defendable and actually quite small, so NATO didn't want to risk having member Pearl to save a vault with such little value. NATO's efforts were elsewhere. They were actively invading and occupying a neighboring nation, SPQR. While SPQR was not part of the war yet, the Holy Jaded Empire, whom led this invasion, claimed they were allowing Mirian attack bunkers to be built on their land. Although this specific action did not bring much backlash, Mir was also planning their next attack, the Siege of Sempiternal, the Empire of Colombia's vault. This siege is largely considered the first significant assault. This vault was so much more valuable and important than anything that had led up to it. Mirian fighters arrived at the vault on February 17th at 4 in the morning. This team, codenamed Mir Team 6, would begin to skybridge over the vault unmonitored for 2.5 hours. At this point, they were nearing the center of the vault. Then Shade Doom, a member of Columbia, sent a Discord ping to the members of NATO at 6:34 a.m., alerting them of the attack. Within 15 minutes of Shade Doom's alert, he went to defend alongside Steve Buscemi, Camo Cool, and Bruno the Miner, whom would soon be joined by more NATO defenders. During the 9-hour-long siege, Godclick, a NATO fighter, would be pearled by Easy 2 Clutch. Another NATO defender, Doommad, would be shot out of his defensive sky bunker, which would also lead to him being pearled. The Mirian attackers would escort his pearl away from the front line, and during this time NATO had the opportunity to destroy Mirian's skybridge and frontline holds after 9 hours. But this siege carried on into the second day, once again starting in the early morning at 5 a.m. The second day would last 15 hours and result in the Mirian's victory. Despite only resulting in one pearling, Ahriman, a fighter from NATO, this battle would go down as the third largest in the entire 2-year-long war, a 15-hour-long battle. After disabling the vault, Mir had momentum in the war, and they would not waste it. Mirian fighters would begin the sacking of Hollow, a NATO nation. From February 24th all the way through March 17th, there would be constant attacks. Spanning across several weeks, 6 members of NATO were pearled. The majority of these pearlings were citizens of Hollow. Mir, on the other hand, suffered no losses and were able to disable all of Hollow's infrastructure, most notably their large underground bunker system. This could have been the end of the war. Mir believed that their goal was completed. Tensions were still high, but large-scale battles seemed to be over. Throughout the following months, Mir would work on their own cities and not launch any attacks. NATO, while still having multiple vaults and cities still standing, had already lost 16 members who pearls now sat in Mir's vault. There were a few minor skirmishes, and NATO took this lull as an opportunity to retake and refortify the previously lost Pinkerton vault. But the main focus of both sides were PR campaigns. Both sides tried to get the neutral nations, who had up to this point not participated in the war, to pick a side. Unfortunately for NATO, instead of growing, they lost members. The nations Columbia, Valeria, and Anwin would peacefully exit the war through diplomacy talks with Mir in May of 2019. That summer, no large events occurred, but it wasn't exactly a time of peace either, and right around the corner was something nobody saw coming. Another war. The Latvian Soccer Dogs Alliance, or LSD, was formed in September 2019. Founded by Ash and Will and populated with players with very contentious histories on the server. Established near Entente and nations in the SATO Alliance, war was declared. LSD's Vault, Hotel California, would be captured with no resistance. Laconia offered asylum to LSD in their capital, Mount Doom. While transferring the resources from Hotel California, they were cut off. The following battle, named the Battle of Hotel California, would begin to widen this war. SATO Entente forces then attacked Mount Doom in retaliation for providing asylum. Now this was a separate war from the NATO-Mir war, but that would begin to change. NATO, Corvus, and Laconia began to have military cooperation. During this Entente-Laconia war, a new group would appear on the server that would finalize the merger of these two wars. Ransackistan, who would obby-bomb or grief multiple nations across the map, would bring these new nations to arms. Now, to new friends in the Civ world, no group just shows up and builds a vault and finds the resources as quickly as Ransackistan did. It was obvious this group was formed from alternative accounts of already active players. It soon became clear that Ransackistan was funded by Corvus and populated by NATO citizens on these alternate accounts. Ransackistan, however, only lasted a week after their initial attacks. The significance of this is that it led to the United Defense Front composed of Icenia, Yodel, Columbia, Imperial Trudence, SPQR, and Southshire to join the fight. The strongest alliance who had not yet joined the NATO-Mir war was now fighting alongside Mir in a separate war. It wouldn't be long after this that UDF would officially join the NATO-Mir war, aligning with Mir in January of 2020. These two separate wars had now created two sides consistent in both. The lines between these wars began to blur and led to a single war containing nearly every active nation on the server. Mir, Entente, and UDF alongside Sado on one side versus NATO, Laconia, and Corvus on the other. Mir would help Entente besiege Mount Doom for 4 months. With attacks happening on a weekly basis, Laconia was only able to resist for so long. Despite a few successes on their part, eventually they would fall from one final push, and Laconia would admit defeat and end their war. During all of this chaos, the Holy Jaded Empire reclaimed the previously lost Pinkerton Vault and had now expanded it into a mega vault. The now even larger Mir side were able to lay a successful second siege to once again reclaim it back. NATO found themselves in a very defensive position. Forces from Hadjitland, Columbia, and Mir were able to break through Corvus's vault. This left NATO now standing alone. In an attempt to regain footing, NATO would lead siege to their old allies turned enemies, Columbia. The target of this was Columbia's Crucible Vault. A NATO spy was actually able to sabotage the Crucible in the early morning of February 17th, 2020. Large quantities of iron and diamond reinforced obsidian were placed, weakening the vault's security. The vault's potion supplies were drained during combat, and NATO mounted a large bedrock level assault on the vault. NATO, now standing alone, was facing world police forces composed of fighters from nearly all nations other than NATO. The world police fighters would arrive. Bob the Builder, a prominent NATO fighter, would be pearled, but the Crucible would have been drained of supplies and weakened. Following the battle for the Crucible would be the Battle of Valeria City, in which Santa would lead a party of world police fighters against NATO force led by Hansu, the leader of Hollow. Skirmishes continued on for a few weeks. A NATO farm used for XP production would be pillaged by the world police, and not long after, Robo-Kaiser, one of NATO's chief grinders who would help supply the war effort, would be pearled, ending the Battle of Valeria City. World Police was able to follow up their hold in Valeria to an attack in Polska, where they'd once again push NATO forces back out of the area. The war seemed to be coming to an end, but it wasn't quite over yet. Before we cover the end, I want to take a moment to thank all the individuals who directly helped gather the information in this video. I also want to thank the Civ Wiki team and its contributors who made this video possible. It's likely clear that this video is a very broad overview of the war. Nearly every event mentioned here was individually covered in a minute, but could easily be a video of its own. There are also some amazing figures who were not directly mentioned, or at least only briefly mentioned. Civ has stories and personalities dating back over the past 10 years, and I plan to cover more of these here on my channel, so subscribe if you would like to hear more about the wonderful world of Civ. NATO, now confined to their small corner of the map, would be attacked again as the world police would continue on the offensive. On June 27th of 2020, the Hollow Vault would fall after a massive siege of over 60 attackers. The siege, lasting 24 hours, would cement itself as the largest successful vault attack in the 10-year history of the Civ genre. Only a few weeks later, July 18th, 2020, the Holy Jaded Empire's Vault Best Western would fall following a separate 24-hour long siege. This vault held pearls of players who NATO had kept pearled for many months. The very next day, with an even greater force, the last remaining NATO vault, the Litter Box, would fall. Within this vault sat the last remaining pearls acquired by NATO. The fall of Litter Box would leave NATO without the wealth to have a functional fighting force and conclude the war. NATO would end with over 50 of its players pearled and held in Mir's vault, while Mir would free the near 20 players it had lost throughout the war. Many of NATO's pearled players are held in this vault to this day. With the war coming to a conclusion, the rebuilding of the world would take over a year. Only in recent months has the server's population returned to pre-war numbers, with nations flourishing as they did before. More stories are unfolding today, so if this is the very first time you've heard of CivClassics, all information to join the server is in the description. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like. Thank you for watching.